They said a cowboy without land or money was worth less than the dust on his boots. One storm-torn night in Texas, Ethan Cole proved them wrong. He was cast out of Ranch Morgan for the crime of saving a crippled colt banished into the rain with nothing but a saddle and his father's worn horsebrush. By dawn, the world had changed. From the hills and valleys, they came wild mustangs and prized ranch stock alike, 300 horses forming ranks, as if answering a call no human ear could hear. At their center stood the man who had chosen mercy over orders, staring in disbelief at the impossible, an army of hooves and breath waiting for him alone. No one could explain it. Some called it a curse, others a miracle. But everyone agreed on one thing: this was the morning a legend began. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The storm had rolled in from the west, like an army at dusk, sweeping over the flatlands of Texas with the rage of 1,000 drums. Rain hammered the roofs of Ranch Morgan, as if the sky itself had chosen to punish the land. The wind howled through cracks in the wooden walls, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and fear. Every time lightning split the night, the world outside flashed white, and the great stable's long rows of timber and iron hinges shuddered beneath the weight of the storm. Inside, men moved hurriedly with ropes and lanterns, their voices raised against the roar of thunder. Boots splashed in the growing puddles as ranch hands fought to keep the terrified horses calm. The animals tossed their heads, snorted, and pawed at the soaked straw, nostrils flaring at the scent of lightning and rain. They were bred for speed and stamina, but even Bloodstock panicked when the heavens broke loose like this. No one wanted to be the man responsible for losing a valuable horse tonight. Everyone knew what would follow if they failed the wrath of the foreman, Frank Dillard. His reputation was legend among the hands. His temper was quick, his punishments quicker. Most men kept their heads down and their mouths shut. Better to be invisible than to attract Dillard's eye. Ethan Cole worked in silence among them, shoulders hunched beneath his drenched shirt. He was young but worn, his frame lean from years of hard labor, his hands scarred from rope burns and broken fences. To the others, he was just another poor drifter who'd found a place to sleep and a wage to earn. But to Ethan, the horses meant more than coin. He watched them with a care the others often lacked. His gaze moved from stall to stall, checking the whites of their eyes, the tremor in their muscles, the way their ears swiveled at each crash of thunder. He whispered to a frightened mare, rubbing her neck, until she stilled his presence, as steady as the beam of an old oak in a storm. The men cursed at the weather, cursed at the work, cursed at the whiskey they wished they were drinking. Ethan said nothing. Words wouldn't hold the timbers together, and they wouldn't soothe the animals' fear. His silence was not weakness, though many mistook it for such. He had learned long ago that in a world like this, words were wasted if not backed by conviction. It was then, as the wind bellowed against the stable doors, that Ethan heard it. A sound faint and fragile, almost lost in the storm. Not the shrill cry of panic from a penned mare or the angry whinny of a stallion, but something smaller, weaker. A pleading note, more breath than voice. A cry of pain. He froze, tilting his head. Another clap of thunder rattled the rafters, but between the echoes, he heard it again. A soft, broken whicker coming from the far corner of the stable beyond the rows of stalls already secured. No one else seemed to notice. The men were too busy with their own tasks, too eager to finish and escape the storm. Ethan dropped the rope in his hands and moved toward the sound. His boots splashed through puddles as he rounded the corner. There, half buried beneath a heavy branch, torn loose from the rafters during the gale, lay a young colt. Its coat was dark, slick with rain and blood. One leg twisted at an unnatural angle, the fetlock already swollen. Its eyes rolled white in terror, but when they locked on Ethan, something in them steadied like a drowning soul catching sight of land. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered, kneeling beside the animal. His hands ran gently over its flank, feeling the tremors of pain. "You're hurt, but I've got you. I've got you." The colt tried to struggle, but the weight of the branch pinned it down. Ethan braced his shoulder against the timber and heaved. Muscles screamed in protest, but slowly, inch by inch, the branch shifted until the colt could pull free. It collapsed onto the straw sides, heaving breath rattling in its throat. Blood darkened the straw beneath its leg. The wound was bad, no question. Many would have called it hopeless. But Ethan had seen worse. He'd tended horses broken in roundups, mares torn, and foaling stallions gashed in barbed wire. Pain was not always the end. Sometimes it was the beginning. He tore a strip from his own shirt and pressed it against the wound, wrapping the leg as tightly as he dared. The colt flinched and then stilled beneath his touch. Ethan's hands moved with quiet certainty, though his heart pounded with anger. Anger that no one else had heard the animals cry. Anger that life on the ranch meant deciding which creatures were worth saving and which were left to die. Behind him, a lantern light flared. Heavy boots splashed closer. A voice like gravel ground against steel barked through the darkness. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Cole Ethan turned. Frank Dillard stood in the glow of his lantern face, shadowed but unmistakably furious. The rain had plastered his hair to his skull, and his thick jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone. "There's a colt down," Ethan said, voice calm, though his pulse raced. "Leg's bad, but he can be saved." Dillard stepped closer, the lantern swinging. Its glow spilled across the colt, illuminating the bandage, already soaked through with blood. Dillard's lip curled. "Worthless," he spat. "Lame leg, bad breeding. You're wasting your time and Morgan's feed." Ethan straightened his jaw, tightening. He's breathing. He's fighting. "That's enough reason to try." "Try," Dillard barked, a laugh, sharp and cruel. "We don't run a charity for broken animals. Morgan pays me to make sure only the strong survive. That one," he jabbed a finger at the colt, "is nothing but a drain. Leave it." The other ranch hands had gathered nearby, drawn by the confrontation. None met Ethan's eyes. They knew the foreman's temper knew better than to cross him. They stood in the shadows, silent witnesses, their loyalty already purchased by fear. Ethan looked back at the colt and then at Dillard. "No," he said quietly. "I won't." The word hung in the air like a spark near gunpowder. Dillard's face darkened, veins bulging at his neck. "You dare defy me, I won't let him die," Ethan said, and his voice, though soft, carried more weight than thunder. He tore another strip from his shirt and bound it tighter around the wound. His hands did not shake. The colt sighed, pressing its head into the straw as if surrendering to the care it had been denied. Dillard's hand shook with fury, lantern light spilling wildly. "You insolent whelp! You think you know better than me. I've been breaking horses since before you could walk." "Maybe so," Ethan replied. "But I know this no creature deserves to be thrown aside while it still fights to live." The silence after his words was sharper than any blade. The men shifted uneasily, waiting for Dillard to explode. And explode he did. He lunged forward, pointing a finger at Ethan's chest. "Pack your things. You're finished here. I want you off Morgan's land before sunrise." Ethan held his ground, though his stomach turned to stone. He glanced once more at the colt. "You'll make it," he whispered. Then he rose, facing Dillard squarely. Behind them, thunder crashed, rattling the rafters. "No room on this ranch for soft hearts," Dillard snarled. "You made your choice, Cole. Now live with it." The other men turned away, unwilling to meet Ethan's gaze. None would defend him. He was alone. Ethan gathered what little he had, the old saddle worn smooth by years of use, a few spare clothes, the wooden brush his father had left him before he died. He packed them into a canvas sack, each item a reminder of a life built on hard miles and harder lessons. When he stepped into the yard, the storm swallowed him whole. Rain pelted his face, soaking his clothes until they clung to his skin. The ground sucked at his boots with every step, mud rising like quicksand. Behind him, Dillard barked orders to secure the stable, his voice cutting through the storm like a whip. The colt's whimpering cry drifted after Ethan, faint but piercing, echoing in his chest. He stopped once, turning back. The outline of the stable loomed against the lightning, dark and unyielding. For a moment, he thought of returning, of fighting harder, but he knew it would only doom him and the colt both. So he walked on, shoulders hunched against the storm, each step heavier than the last. Lightning lit the valley in harsh strokes, painting Ethan's solitary figure in silver before plunging him back into shadow. Thunder rolled like judgment, and the rain drowned out every thought but one. If there's a miracle left in this world, Ethan whispered into the storm, let it be for you, Ashfire. And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind the only home he had, the only work he knew, driven out not for failure but for compassion. The storm closed over him, and the last sound he carried into the darkness was the colt's weak, desperate whinny refusing to be silenced. The storm swallowed Ethan whole. Rain lashed down in sheets so heavy they blurred the world into streaks of silver, each drop stinging his skin like a whip. He trudged through it, boots sinking into the sodden earth, each step a battle against mud that clung and sucked as though it wanted him to stay down. His shirt clung to his back, plastered cold against his ribs, and the canvas bag slung across his shoulder grew heavier with every stride as water seeped into the cloth. Lightning split the horizon, painting his weary face in stark flashes, hollowing his cheekbones, catching the exhaustion in his eyes. Those eyes had seen loss before, too much of it, but tonight they carried a weight deeper than hardship. Tonight they carried grief. Only hours ago he had been one of Morgan's hired men, another nameless cowboy in a ranch full of them. He had a cot in the loft above the stables, a plate of beans when supper came, a purpose in the work that filled his days. It was not much, but for a man like Ethan Cole, who had no home of his own and no family left to write to, it had been something. Now it was gone. All gone. Torn away in the span of a single storm because he had chosen compassion over obedience. The wind roared across the empty lane, sweeping through branches broken by the gale, carrying the smell of pine and wet clay. The road was deserted. No light shone in the windows of the few scattered homes. Even the dogs had taken shelter, their barks silenced by thunder. Ethan pulled the brim of his hat low, though it did nothing to shield him, and pressed forward, searching for a way out of Morgan's land. Dillard had ordered him gone by sunrise. Ethan would not give the foreman the satisfaction of finding him still there come morning. He walked for hours, his legs heavy, his breath steaming in the cold night. The rain never relented. It beat down in waves, drumming against his shoulders, seeping into his boots until his socks squelched with each step. The road narrowed, then split, then vanished altogether in the dark, leaving him to stumble through thickets and over roots slick with water. His body ached, but worse than the physical strain was the emptiness hollowing him from within. Homeless, jobless, cast out like refuse. At last, when his muscles screamed for rest, Ethan caught sight of a rocky outcrop rising from the slope ahead. A ledge jutted outward, forming a shallow overhang where the rain broke and fell away in sheets. He staggered toward it, half crawling the last few feet, then collapsed beneath its shelter. The ground was still damp, and the air smelled of moss and stone, but compared to the storm outside, it felt like sanctuary. He leaned against the wall of rock chest, heaving breath ragged in the cold. His whole body shook, not just from the chill, but from exhaustion, from the weight of a day that had stripped him of everything. Rain drummed against the stone roof above him, a relentless rhythm like war drums beating at the edge of a battlefield. The sound echoed inside the hollow, amplifying his loneliness, until it pressed down on him like a physical force. For the first time since leaving the ranch, he let himself sag head falling into his hands. When his breathing steadied, he dragged the canvas bag into his lap and opened it. The contents were pitiful, the sum total of a life spent drifting from ranch to ranch, an old saddle cracked and worn that had carried him across countless miles of dust and prairie. A handful of clothes damp and threadbare. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a wooden brush. The brush had belonged to his father. Its handle was worn smooth by years of use, bristles bent from grooming horses long since gone to earth. Ethan held it carefully, as if it might break in his hands. The memory it carried was heavier than the storm. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was a boy again, standing beside his father in a sunlit pasture. His father's big hands guided his smaller ones, showing him how to move the brush in long, steady strokes down a horse's flank. Not too rough, Ethan. Gentle. Always gentle. A horse is a friend, not a machine. You treat him with respect, he'll carry you further than any man. The words were etched into Ethan's bones, words he had lived by, even when the world told him they were foolish. Tonight, those words clashed violently with the sneering voice of Frank Dillard, who had dismissed Ashfire as worthless. A broken animal. A waste of feed. Ethan clenched the brush until his knuckles whitened. His father had been poor just as he was now, but he had understood something the wealthy foremen and ranch lords never did, that the measure of a man was how he treated the powerless. He leaned back against the rock eyes, open to the blackness beyond the ledge. The rain still fell, but it no longer drowned out the sound in his mind, Ashfire's weak, desperate whinny. He could see it vividly, the colt lying half-pinned beneath the branch eyes, wild with terror until they had found his. He remembered the warmth of its breath on his hands, the way it had gone still beneath his touch, as if it knew he was there to help. The image haunted him. He had walked away because he'd had no choice, but his soul had stayed behind in that stable. He could almost feel the colt's gaze, even now, burning through the storm, pleading with him not to give up. The pain swelled in his chest until he thought it might burst. He had lost so much already: his family, his land, every dream he had carried as a younger man. Horses had been the only constant in his life, the only thing he understood, and the only creatures that seemed to understand him in return. And tonight, even that had been torn from him. His throat tightened, and he bowed his head, letting the storm hide the tears he would never admit to. Yet even in the grip of despair, the memory of Ashfire would not release him. It clung stubbornly, like a spark refusing to be extinguished by the rain. Ethan wiped his face and drew a shuddering breath. "No," he whispered into the hollow. "Not like this." He shifted, pulling his thin coat tighter around him, and stared out into the night. Lightning flickered across the valley, illuminating sheets of rain and distant ridge lines. Then, voice low, hoarse but steady, he made his vow. "If there's breath left in me, I'll come back for you, Ashfire. I'll come back no matter the cost." The words sank into the storm, carried away on the wind. But in speaking them, he felt a strange calm. A seed had been planted in the soil of his grief, small, fragile, but alive. Hope. He lay down on the damp ground, curling into himself against the cold. The coat was no shield, the rock, no comfort, but exhaustion weighed heavier than discomfort. His eyes drifted shut, though sleep came fitful and thin. Outside, the wind raged on, tearing at the trees, shrieking through the canyons. But in Ethan's heart, the vow burned like a coal, refusing to die. As thunder rolled into the distance, and the rain softened to a steady patter, he slept at last, uneasy alone, but clinging to the single thought that kept him alive: Ashfire. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the colt's weak whinny echoed still, as if answering him. The storm had finally spent itself. By dawn, the sky was a washed-out gray, heavy clouds drifting apart as if exhausted from their own fury. The rain had ceased, leaving the world slick and glistening. A thin veil of mist clung to the valley floor, curling upward like smoke from a dying fire. Drops of water fell in steady rhythm from the overhang above Ethan Cole, plinking onto the stones beside him. He stirred with a groan, stiff and cold, his limbs reluctant to obey. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his body as though the storm had claimed them for its own. His joints ached from sleeping on bare rock. When he sat up, the movement sent a lance of pain through his shoulders, and his breath fogged in the chill air. For a moment, he was disoriented, blinking at the pale morning light. The shelter of stone, the damp earth beneath him, the hollow emptiness in his chest, it all came rushing back. He rubbed his eyes, bracing himself for another day of wandering, without direction, a man cast out and left to drift like tumbleweed. But then he heard it. At first, he thought it only the echo of the storm thunder rolling far away. Yet it carried a different rhythm, a cadence that pulsed against the ground itself. Hooves. He froze, head tilted, listening hard. The sound was faint, distant, as if carried on the mist. But it grew. The rhythm was steady, not the erratic clatter of a few animals fleeing, but a unified drumbeat that swelled with every passing moment. It was as though the earth itself had found a heartbeat. Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent his life among horses' roundups, auctions, ranch herds scattered across the plains, but never had he heard hooves like this. The cadence rolled through the valley, in waves building, expanding, until it filled the morning silence. His pulse raced in answer. This was no ordinary gathering. This was a multitude. Ethan staggered to his feet, his hand gripping the old saddle beside him, as if it might anchor him to reality. Mist swirled across the meadow below, obscuring his view. But the sound kept coming closer and closer. The ground beneath his boots trembled faintly, a shiver that matched the pounding in his chest. What in God's name could bring so many together? Not cattle lumbered, stumbled, scattered. This was coordinated, purposeful. Horses, yes. But how many and why? He licked his lips, the dryness in his mouth at odds with the damp air. He stood at the edge of the ledge, heart hammering, waiting for the mist to reveal its secret. Shapes emerged. At first, only a handful faint silhouettes against the rising sun. A few horses crested the eastern ridge, their forms spectral in the pale light. Ethan squinted, scarcely daring to believe his eyes. More followed, 10, 20, 50, pouring over the ridge in an unbroken stream. It was as if the land itself had cracked open and released a river of flesh and bone manes, streaming, hooves flashing. The first light of morning caught their wet coats, turning them to liquid silver and burnished copper. Steam rose from their nostrils, blending with the mist, until they seemed otherworldly creatures of legend, galloping into the new day. Ethan's breath caught. He recognized some of them. Not wild mustangs, not strays. Ranch horses. Copper, the big chestnut gelding from Henderson's spread. Thunder, the glossy black mare that Miller swore was the best broodstock in the county. And God above Duchess, the white Arabian belonging to Banker Banks, prized like a jewel behind locked gates. Yet here they were mingling with mustangs, moving as one tide. No halters, no ropes, no riders. and they did not scatter when they reached the valley floor. Instead, they slowed, grouping together the rhythm of their hooves, shifting from thunderous charge to measured march. Ethan gripped the saddle tighter, his knuckles whitening. The meadow before him filled with horses. Not a dozen, not 100, but hundreds spilling into every patch of open ground, their bodies packed shoulder to shoulder. The air grew thick with their breath, a fog of warmth against the morning chill. But it was the order that froze Ethan's blood. Horses did not behave this way. Not without ropes and men shouting whips, cracking fences, closing them in. Yet these animals lined themselves in rows. Heads high, ears forward, their gaze fixed not on each other, but on him. They faced him. Ethan staggered back a step, stunned. His breath came shallow, chest rising and falling, as if he had run miles. His mind raced with questions that had no answers. How had they escaped? Why had they come? What force could possibly bind together ranch stock from across the valley and wild mustangs that had never known a master? He stood on trembling legs, the saddle in his hand, the only thing keeping him upright. A wall of horses stretched before him, silent, expectant, their collective stare pressing down on him like judgment. He spotted familiar coats among the sea of bodies, each recognition tightening the knot in his stomach. Hendersons, Millers, Bankses, animals from ranches miles apart. He should have been afraid, terrified of being trampled by 300 beasts. Instead, he felt something stranger awe. The mist thickened, curling between them, like smoke on a battlefield. Ethan stepped forward without realizing it, his boots sinking into damp grass. The line of horses shifted with him, not breaking formation, but moving subtly like ripples in water. Each step he took seemed to draw them closer, as though he were a magnet and they iron. His pulse thundered in his ears. Sweat slicked his brow despite the cold. Lord Almighty. His voice cracked, carried away on the breeze. Why me? The words slipped out, unbidden, more prayer than question. And in that moment he swore he saw comprehension in their eyes. The nearest horse, a black stallion with a jagged blaze down its nose, took a step forward. It lowered its head slightly, one ear flicking toward him, as if acknowledging the plea in his voice. Ethan's breath hitched. The world tilted around him. He gripped the saddle as if it were the last solid thing in creation. The sun broke through the thinning clouds, shafts of light piercing the mist. Golden beams washed over the valley, illuminating the scene in stark clarity. Ethan blinked against the brilliance. His vision filled with horses, hundreds upon hundreds arranged across the meadow in the silent ranks. Their manes shone like banners, their coats glistened like polished armor. He counted in disbelief. Dozens became scores, scores became hundreds. Nearly 300 strong, a host of living muscle and will. The silence was profound. No snorting, no stamping, no wild calls. Only the soft hiss of breath and the whisper of wind in the grass. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. They were not just a herd. They were an assembly. Ethan's throat tightened, a lump rising he could not swallow. It felt wrong to speak, as though words might shatter the fragile spell holding this vision together. Yet his heart knew the truth before his mind dared to name it. This was no accident. It was a summons, a gathering not of chance, but of purpose. And he, Ethan Cole, broke Cowboy cast out in disgrace, was at its center. The sun lifted higher, burning away the last threads of mist. Horses filled the valley as far as he could see, their bodies gleaming in the light. From a distance, they looked like an army of silver-clad warriors standing sentinel in perfect formation. Ethan stood rooted, unable to move his chest, rising and falling in shallow gasps. His entire life, he had known horses as creatures of flesh and bone, noble, yes, but bound by instinct, by hunger, by the limits of nature. What he saw now defied all of that. It was as though the wild itself had chosen him. A tremor ran through him, half fear, half exhilaration. He was nobody, nothing. Yet here, before the gaze of 300 horses, he felt both infinitely small and impossibly important. The dawn had not just broken the storm, it had broken his world. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan knew whatever path lay ahead, his life would never again belong only to himself. Ethan stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, 300 pairs of eyes fixed on him, their breath misting in the cool dawn. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, his heart still galloping faster than any stallion among them. The storm had passed, yet in its wake, it had left something more bewildering, more frightening and more extraordinary than any destruction, wind, or rain could cause. For a long moment, he simply stared back at the herd, his mind groping for an explanation that did not exist. Then slowly he inhaled. The breath trembled in his lungs, but he held it, steadying himself. His boots shifted in the wet grass, and then he took a single step forward. The effect was immediate. A ripple passed through the horses as if some invisible signal had been given. Hooves struck the ground in unison. The entire herd advanced one measured pace, mirroring his movement exactly. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He took another step. Again the herd moved with him, as precise and deliberate as soldiers marching to a drum. They did not crowd him. They did not surge ahead or falter behind. Instead, they formed a living column, stretching into the mist, silent, but for the low thud of hooves pressing into damp soil. The air vibrated with the rhythm steady and ordered a cadence that sent shivers racing up Ethan's spine. He tightened his grip on the old saddle in his hand, the leather slick with rain. His voice broke the silence, a whisper torn between awe and fear. "If this is a dream," he murmured, "God help me, don't let me wake." The path back to Ranch Morgan wound through the low hills still slick from the storm. Ethan walked it as he had countless times before, but never like this. Behind him flowed a river of horses, their bodies streaming down the slopes in endless ranks. Their hooves pounded in unison, a rhythm so steady it echoed like the roll of distant drums. The sun crept higher, its pale light piercing the remnants of mist. It caught the sheen of wet coats, painting them in hues of copper, chestnut, and silver. Manes tossed in the morning breeze, tails lashed in quiet energy. From every angle the sight was otherworldly, a ragged cowboy in torn, mud-stained clothes, leading an army of beasts across the hills. In the distance, scattered farmsteads clung to the valley floor. The people within had risen early to mend fences blown down by the storm, to check stock and survey damage. They looked up from their work when the sound reached them, first a faint drumming, then a crescendo that shook window panes. One by one they stepped out of their doors, eyes widening. Children were the first to cry out. "Mama horses, look at all the horses." Women pulled shawls tight, shading their eyes as they tried to count the impossible number. Men dropped tools, jaws slack, watching the tide of animals crest the ridge. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers, while others simply stared, mouths open, unable to comprehend. Word spread faster than the hoofbeats. By the time Ethan and the herd reached the outskirts of the town near Morgan's land, people were lining the dirt roads, pointing, shouting, their voices a mix of fear and awe. Good Lord, above, what is this, 300? Maybe more. Where are they going? And always at the center of their astonished gaze, the figure of Ethan Cole. Head-bowed, boots heavy in the mud, walking with the weight of destiny pressing down on his shoulders. The gates of Ranch Morgan loomed ahead. They hung crooked on their hinges, battered by the storm. Mud stretched in broad, slick patches across the yard. Fences were down boards, splintered troughs overturned. Ranch hands were already at work, hammering nails, setting posts, sweeping away debris. At first, they heard only the approaching thunder of hooves, a sound they knew well, but had never heard multiplied to such magnitude. They paused hammers in mid-swing, eyes narrowing. Then the herd appeared over the rise. The effect was instant. Tools clattered to the ground. Men froze, breath stolen from their lungs. Horses filled the road shoulder to shoulder, chest to chest, a tide of muscle and grace, moving with eerie precision. At their head walked Ethan, his clothes soaked and torn, his hat low, one hand gripping a weathered saddle, as though it were the only tether to reality. The men gasped, muttered curses, rubbed their eyes, as if expecting the vision to vanish. One dropped his cap, letting it roll into the mud. Another stumbled backward, pressing himself flat against the wall of the barn. None had ever seen horses gather in such order. Horses spooked, scattered, bolted, but never marched. The sound of hooves filled the yard, echoing off wooden walls and rattling the windows of the main house. And yet, there was no chaos. The animals slowed, spread out, and came to a halt in lines that stretched across the property. Their heads lifted in unison, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as they breathed as one. The silence that followed was deeper than thunder. Ethan walked through the gate, past the very posts from which he had been banished only hours earlier. The memory of Dillard's voice, "Get off Morgan's land before sunrise," still burned in his ears. Now, as he crossed the threshold, 300 horses crossed with him. The front door of the big house slammed open. Silas Morgan appeared first, broad-shouldered, in a long black coat, his silver hair plastered to his skull. He descended the steps 2 at a time, boots striking wood like gunshots. Behind him, Frank Dillard emerged, his face, pale lips, pressed thin sweat beading at his temple despite the morning chill. Morgan stopped short when he reached the yard. His eyes swept across the scene, row after row of horses, steam rising from their bodies, Ethan Cole standing at the center. The color drained from his face. "This," he muttered, voice breaking. Then louder, "What in God's name?" Dillard stumbled down behind him, nearly tripping on the last step. His eyes darted wildly as though searching for some rational explanation in a vision that had none. He wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve, but the sweat kept coming. The herd did not move. Their stillness was more unnerving than chaos. It was not the silence of fear, but of intention, as if they awaited a signal, some verdict to be passed. Morgan's gaze fixed on Ethan. He drew himself up, clinging to the authority that had carried him through decades of ranching. His voice rang out harsh and demanding, though it wavered at the edges. "Cole," he barked, "what devilry is this? What trick are you playing at?" Ethan stopped at the center of the yard, and the sea of horses fanning out behind him like a living tide. His back was straight, though his hands still trembled around the saddle. He raised his head, slowly meeting Morgan's eyes. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole stood not as a hired hand to be ordered and dismissed, but as the chosen center of something far greater than the rancher before him. Then the ground trembled. It began as a subtle shift, a murmur in the earth that Ethan felt before he heard. Hooves struck in rhythm, not the chaos of a stampede, but something deliberate, coordinated, purposeful. The herd moved as if guided by a single will. Lines dissolved, then reformed. Shoulders brushed, tails flicked, bodies pressed closer, rearranging into something new. Within moments, the mass had split opening like a door upon invisible hinges. Horses peeled away from one another with uncanny precision, dividing themselves into 2 long rows that stretched across the yard. A corridor formed between them, straight as a road and wide enough for one man to walk. The sound of their breathing filled the air. Steam rose from their nostrils, mingling into a haze that hung in the chill, carrying the scent of sweat and rain-soaked hides. Not a whinny, not a snort, only breath steady and heavy, as though hundreds of lungs inhaled and exhaled together. The ranch hands who watched from the shadows of the barn exchanged nervous glances. One man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a stone tossed on water. Another took a step back until his shoulders pressed against the timber wall. No one spoke. No one dared. Ethan stared at the corridor opening before him, his mouth dry. For the briefest instant, he thought of the old stories, the Red Sea parting prophets, walking through divine waters. But this was no scripture. This was 300 horses standing aside, offering him passage. His knees trembled. His fingers tightened on the saddle in his grasp. The truth struck him like a hammer. The herd was not opening the way for themselves. They were opening it for him. He hesitated at the threshold. The corridor stretched ahead like a tunnel carved from flesh and spirit, ending at the weather-beaten stable where he had been cast out only hours before. The very place Dillard had told him to leave behind forever. Ethan drew in a breath so deep it burned. His boots shifted against the mud. Then he stepped forward. The herd responded instantly. Every horse along the corridor stood rigid bodies, taut ears, forward eyes blazing in the dim light. Their heads turned as one to watch him pass, but not a hoof moved out of place. They were statues of muscle and breath, alive, but utterly controlled. Ethan walked slowly, each footfall sinking into wet earth with a heavy squelch. The sound of his steps echoed louder than the storm itself had seemed hammering in his ears. Between the lines of horses, mist rose from their bodies like incense clinging to the air. Their breath rolled across him in warm waves. He could feel it against his face, on his neck, down his arms, hot and rhythmic, as though he passed between the bellows of a great forge. He tried not to shiver, but the sensation crawled down his spine. It was not fear exactly, but something more primal, something that whispered of ritual, of ceremony. He felt as though he had stumbled into an ancient rite, a mystery older than any ranch, older than Texas itself. His hands shook as he whispered to himself, "What are you showing me?" But no voice answered, only the endless sound of his footsteps. On wet ground, the soft hiss of 300 lungs surrounding him, and the corridor narrowing as he neared its end. The stable loomed before him, dark against the pale morning. Its timbers sagged under the weight of last night's storm. The door at the far end, half splintered and hanging askew, rattled once then again. Ethan stopped dead. The door shuddered, creaked, and slowly swung open. From the shadowed interior stepped a figure he knew as well as his own reflection. His breath caught tears stinging his eyes before he even understood why. Ashfire. The colt emerged into the light, his coat gleaming with a wet sheen, each hair lit by the rising sun as if gilded. The makeshift bandages Ethan had tied with strips of his shirt were gone, torn away or discarded, leaving bare the leg that only hours before had bled onto the straw. But where there should have been swelling and ruin, there was only smooth skin, whole and strong. A faint scar, no more than a pale line, traced the place of the wound, less a mark of weakness than a badge of survival. Ashfire lifted his head high. His ears pricked forward. His nostrils flared wide as he drew in a great breath. Then, throwing back his neck, he loosed a cry. The whinny split the air sharp and clarion carrying across the yard like a trumpet blast. It echoed off the barn, off the hills, rolling into the valley beyond. The herd answered. Hundreds of throats lifted their voices in unison, a chorus of power. that shook the ground. It was not panic, not frenzy. It was proclamation. Ashfire had returned, and his kin bore witness. The ranch hand staggered back as if struck. One dropped the pitchfork in his hand, the tines clattering against stone. Another pressed trembling fingers to his lips, eyes wide. "My God," someone whispered. "He's walking. Whole." Ashfire's gaze never wavered from Ethan. Step by deliberate step, he crossed the last few feet of the corridor, his hooves striking firm and sure. No limp, no falter. Each stride was a declaration. Ethan could not breathe. His chest ached tight with disbelief and wonder. When the colt reached him, he stopped close enough that Ethan could feel the heat radiating from his body. Slowly, carefully, Ethan raised a trembling hand. Ashfire lowered his head. His muzzle pressed gently against Ethan's shoulder, the contact soft but sure. The world dissolved. Ethan closed his eyes, his body shuddering as he released the breath he had been holding since the night before. The smell of the colt filled his senses, wet hide, clean earth, the faint tang of sweat. Tears blurred his vision as he laid his palm against the strong curve of Ashfire's neck. "You made it," he whispered hoarsely. "By God, you made it." The colt huffed warm breath washing across Ethan's face. The gesture was tender, deliberate, unmistakable. A thank you without words. A promise returned. Ethan's heart hammered wildly, but for the first time in years it did so with joy. This was not just an animal saved. It was proof undeniable and living that compassion was never wasted, that even in a world ruled by cruelty and coin mercy carried power. He pressed his forehead to Ashfire's eyes, shut tight, and in that moment, all the storms of his life fell silent. But the silence did not last. Ashfire shifted. His body turned muscles rippling until he stood broadside between Ethan and the men, watching from the house steps. His head rose high, ears stiff, his dark eyes locking on Silas Morgan and Frank Dillard. The colt no longer looked like a fragile orphan to be discarded. He stood like a war horse before battle, every line of his body declaring defiance. His hooves dug into the earth chest, expanding as he drew in a deep breath. Ethan felt the change ripple through him. Ashfire was not merely shielding him with flesh. He was proclaiming allegiance, announcing to all who watched, "This man is mine, and I am his." Morgan paled. The great rancher who had faced storm's drought and rivals across decades stumbled a half step back, as though confronted with something his wealth and will could not master. Dillard's face drained of blood. His mouth worked opening and closing like that of a fish pulled gasping from water. Sweat trickled down his temple. His voice broke when he finally managed words. It's healed," he stammered. "Completely healed." The murmur spread like wildfire through the gathered workers. "He's whole." The colt's sound. Impossible. The air grew heavy, every eye flicking between Ethan the colt and the men who had ordered both abandoned. The miracle stood undeniable before them. The yard still trembled from the resonance of Ashfire's triumphant cry, when another sound began to roll across the valley, distant at first, but growing with each passing heartbeat. Hooves. Again. Not the synchronized rhythm of the herd within the ranch, but another column, sharper, heavier, driven by men. The ranch hands turned their heads toward the road. Even the gathered horses pricked their ears, eyes flashing toward the sound. A moment later, the first riders appeared through the thinning morning mist. Sheriff Tom Dunnar rode in front, his broad shoulders hunched beneath his coat, his badge glinting like a shard of steel against the dull light. Behind him thundered Henderson Miller Banks and half a dozen other ranchers from the valley. Their faces were drawn and furious eyes rimmed red from a night spent searching for lost stock. Alongside them rode hired guns, rifles slung across their saddles, jaws set with grim intent. They galloped into the yard and pulled up hard horses skidding on wet earth flanks, foaming with sweat. All at once their voices erupted in shock. 300 horses stood packed shoulder to shoulder, filling every corner of Ranch Morgan. The spectacle was so overwhelming that even the hardened ranchers' men who had lived their lives counting cattle by the thousands froze. Henderson's voice broke first, a raw shout of accusation that carried across the yard. "That's Copper, my gelding. You've stolen him, Morgan. You and that drifter of yours." Ethan flinched at the volume. Ashfires shifted, standing firm in front of him, as if shielding him from the storm of men as much as he had shielded him from Dillard. The crowd thickened as villagers gathered at the gates, drawn by the noise. Farmers, wives, children, they pressed close, whispering, pointing their faces pale with wonder. Word of the miracle had spread like sparks in dry grass. Now the entire community watched breathless as the valley's power brokers confronted one another. The accusations flew fast and hot. Henderson jabbed a finger at Morgan, his face twisted with rage. "You've stolen half the valley's stock. Do you think we wouldn't notice? Do you think we wouldn't come?" Miller rode forward, eyes narrowing as he spotted the black mare among their herd. "Thunder? That's my Thunder. She couldn't have crossed 50 miles in the teeth of a storm. You brought her here, Morgan. Don't you dare deny it." Banks ground his teeth so hard his jaw quivered. "And Duchess? My Duchess worth more than this entire ranch. She would never run free on her own. You've orchestrated this, all of it." "This is theft." Morgan stood stiff, fists balled at his sides. The lines of age on his face deepened, but his voice, when it came, was calm, too calm. "You're raving. I don't understand it myself. They just appeared. Came like the storm delivered them." Sheriff Dunbar swung his horse forward, his presence commanding silence. His eyes swept the yard, calculating, unsettled. "I've got reports of missing horses from 17 ranches," he said. 17. And here they are, every one of them standing on Morgan's land. You'll have to do better than shrugging, Morgan. You owe this valley an explanation." Men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Several hands gripped the butts of their pistols, their eyes flicking from Morgan to the herd. The air thickened with tension, the kind that begged for a spark to ignite it. The spark came when a rancher at the edge of the crowd thrust out his arm, pointing at Ethan. "Him," the man bellowed. "That drifter, I saw him walking at the head of them. He led this whole parade back here." A murmur ran through the assembly voices, blending into a low growl. Eyes swung toward Ethan, narrowing with suspicion, hostility. Ethan's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, but the lump stuck, choking him. He stood frozen, Ashfire's body pressed between him and their accusing gazes. His voice came out hoarse, cracking under the weight of their stares. "I didn't steal a thing. I swear it. I found one colt hurt in the storm, just one, and I stayed to bind his leg. That's all. The rest came on their own." The ranchers laughed, sharp and scornful like the barking of dogs. On their own, Henderson sneered. "You expect us to believe horses traveled miles in a storm just to find you a cowboy?" Nobody, Miller added, spitting into the mud. "Ragged, poor, not worth the dust on his boots. And suddenly you're Pied Piper to 300 head. Even Banks joined in, his voice dripping contempt. You've bewitched them somehow. Trickery. No other explanation." Ethan shook his head, his voice low but firm. "There was no trick. I just didn't leave him to die." He laid a trembling hand on Ashfire's neck. And maybe they heard that. Morgan's eyes lingered on Ethan longer than the others. In them was a flicker, confusion, suspicion, but something else too. Perhaps recognition. Even Morgan, proud and hardened, could not deny the impossibility of what he had seen. But the ranchers were not softened. Their anger boiled hotter. "You'll return our horses," Henderson barked, pulling a revolver half out of its holster. "Or we'll take them back ourselves." The words shattered what restraint remained. Men cursed, spurred their mounts forward a few steps. Others gripped rifles tighter, knuckles pale. Ranch hands ducked behind fence rails. Women clutched children and pulled them back from the gates. It was seconds from erupting into madness. Ethan's heart thundered. He felt ash fire stiffen the colt's muscles, hardening beneath his hand ears, flat ready to spring. 300 horses shifted uneasily, stamping hooves, swishing tails, the sound like distant drums. Ethan could taste the air, thick, metallic, like lightning about to strike. Sweat trickled down his spine despite the morning chill. If a single shot was fired, the yard would dissolve into chaos and blood would drench the mud. It was ash fire who saved them. The colt's head lifted suddenly, ears sharp as blades. Then he opened his throat and screamed. The whinny was not the frightened cry of a young horse, nor the playful call of a colt to his dam. It was something else entirely. Something ancient, primal. The sound soared through the yard, piercing and resonant, a note that seemed to draw the marrow from every bone present. The herd answered. First a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. Voices rose one after another until they blended into a single living choir. It was not chaos, not noise. It was music layered and rich, a harmony so strange it seemed to reach beyond human hearing. The notes swelled, dipped, and soared again, weaving together like strands of memory. It was a song of storms and pain, of fear and endurance. It was the story of chains and ropes, of corrals and darkness, of men who measured worth in coin. But beneath it pulsed another theme, one of defiance, of loyalty, of a human who had chosen mercy when all others turned away. The song climbed higher, a crescendo that filled the valley and sent echoes racing along the ridges. Men dropped their guns as though the sound itself struck their arms numb. Horses beneath the mounted ranchers trembled, ears flat, refusing to advance. The chorus reached its peak, a sound so vast it shook the earth beneath their boots. Then slowly it faded, diminishing, until only silence remained. The silence was worse than the sound. Every man, woman, and child stood, frozen eyes, wide mouths slack. Even the wind seemed to pause, rustling the grass with reverence. The only sound was the steady breathing of 300 horses, rising and falling like the lungs of a single creature. Henderson's voice cracked first, barely more than a whisper, but it carried in the stillness. "Sweet Lord above," they sang. A ranch hand near the fence gripped his hat to his chest, tears streaking his face unnoticed. "They're not beasts anymore," he murmured. "Not just beasts." No one contradicted him. Not a single man laughed. Sheriff Dunar shifted in his saddle. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his hat. His grizzled head bowed the lines of his weathered face, drawn deep. When he spoke, his voice was rough, strained, but certain. "I came here to arrest horse thieves," he said. "But this..." He gestured with a trembling hand at the herd at Ashfire, standing proud at Ethan's side. "This is beyond law, beyond all of us." The words fell like a gavel strike, a verdict none dared oppose. And in that yard, under the gaze of 300 silent witnesses, the valley's old rules cracked. Something greater had stepped onto the land, and no badge, no wealth, no whip could command it. For a long heartbeat after the herd's strange hymn, the ranch lay sealed in a holy quiet. Breath plumed from 300 muzzles. The air seemed to glow with something unnameable, reverence, fear, recognition no one could tell. Even the wind held itself back, as if reluctant to disturb whatever had descended upon the valley. Frank Dillard shattered it. He had stood rigid through the song, jaw-clenched eyes, burning his pride, bleeding out in front of his men and his employer. Now the color rose in his face, a furious tide that flooded his neck and ears until he was red as a branding iron. His breath came rough, and when he spoke, it tore through the yard like a rasp dragged over stone. "You're all bewitched," he cried, voice cracking under the strain. "Horses are horses, meat bones, sweat, nothing more." He jabbed a shaking finger at Ashfire. "You," he spat the word, "you are tricks and weak-hearted nonsense." No one answered. The herd merely stared. Ethan felt Ashfire's chest rise and fall beneath his palm, warm and steady like a drum calling courage up from the earth. Dillard's laugh was raw and desperate. "I'll prove it right now. I'll end this madness." His hand blurred to the holster. Metal flashed. "Don't," someone shouted, one voice among many. But the word broke apart in the open air, too fragile to stop anything at all. The pistol came up muzzle dark as a snake's eye. Dillard leveled it at Ashfire's heart. "One dead horse," he snarled, "and your miracle dies with it." A woman near the gate gasped. A boy turned and buried his face in his mother's skirt. Henderson swore aloud. Miller's horse sidestepped and tossed its head ears pinned. Ethan didn't step away. He didn't have time to think about stepping away. The Colt did it for him. Ashfire moved with the quick, perfect certainty of a creature that is already chosen. He planted himself squarely between man and gun, head-high ears, like blades' eyes, fixed on the trembling line of Dillard's aim. The Colt's body touched Ethan's knees, solid alive, an iron wall of will. Ethan's hand found the ledge of Ashfire's shoulder and stayed there, steadying, receiving steadiness back. In that contact, the boy his father had taught to groom horses, and the man he had become met and agreed. Whatever came would come to both of them. Behind them, the herd stirred. 100 iron shoes struck wet earth, one beat then another, a rolling thunder that made the ground hum in Ethan's bones. It was not a charge and not a panic. It was a warning, the old world knocking on the door of the new, asking if it truly meant to enter. Dillard's finger curled against the trigger. Sweat slicked his temple and traced a dark line through the dust on his cheek. At this distance, he couldn't miss. At this distance, he could name the price of his pride in ounces of blood and the sound of a body falling. "Frank." Morgan's voice came low and dangerous from the steps. "Put it down." Dillard didn't lower the pistol. He didn't even blink. He bared his teeth in something that was not a smile. "All of you romantics fools, watch closely." The muzzle coughed a breath as his finger tightened. Ethan felt the Colt brace muscles bunching beneath skin, ready to spring to take the bullet meant for him or meet it head-on. Ethan couldn't tell which, and suddenly the future hung by the thin hinge of one man's fear. Morgan moved. He came off the steps with a speed that belied his age and bulk boots, pounding coat, flaring like a black wing. In 2 great strides, he was within arm's reach. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He seized Dillard's wrist with a rancher's hand and wrenched. The pistol tore free and clattered into the mud. "Enough," Morgan thundered the word, ringing across the yard like a shot that had chosen to be mercy. "You hear me? Enough." Silence slammed down again. Even the horses seemed to draw back from the edge they'd gathered on. Dillard lurched off balance, eyes rolling from the pistol face down in the mud to the man who had taken it. He looked small for the first time, a shadow of the foreman who had ruled the yard by fear. Morgan didn't give the moment time to sag. He turned his head, voice cutting each word, hammered clean and cold. "You're finished, Frank." He pointed with an open hand at the road, the gates, the wide world beyond. "You have no place here. Not after last night. Not after this." He stepped closer, and when he spoke again, the iron was colder still. "Get off my land." It was as if a rope had snapped in every mind present. Men who had stood frozen now stirred, glancing at one another, some in shock, some in relief, a few in something like gratitude. The old order had been a roof over their heads and a weight on their backs both at once. They felt it lift. Dillard staggered, the color draining fast as it had come. His voice came out a strangled croak. You can't mean it." "After everything I've done for this ranch," Morgan's face did not change. "You nearly cost us the finest horse I've ever seen," he said, voice flat. "Then you tried to put a bullet in him because you couldn't stand to be wrong." His eyes were as cold as creek water in winter. "I don't need that kind of man shaping anything under my name." A hand near the barn lifted an inch as if to offer Dillard some shred of brotherhood, then sank again. No one stepped forward. No one spoke up. The yard had made up its mind. Someone whispered, awed and a little afraid, "He's really fired." Dillard's eyes scraped across the faces around him, their turned-away looks, their expressions emptied of the deference that had fed him. He sought Henderson Miller Banks, but found only men who'd come for horses, not for him. He looked back to Morgan and found a door shut and barred. He bent, scooped the pistol from the mud with shaking fingers, and holstered it without meeting anyone's eyes. For a heartbeat, he stared at Ethan, at the Colt standing guard in front of him, at the quiet steadiness in the younger man's face. And something like hatred and something like confusion fought across his features. Then he dropped his gaze and started walking. He made it to the gate under a rain of whispers and silence. No one jeered. The humiliation was heavier without the noise. His boots sank into the same mud he'd driven Ethan into the night before. And in that mirror, he saw something truer than pride had let him see the end of a kingdom built on fear, and the beginning of one that would not have room for him. At the gate, he paused, as if expecting someone to call him back. No one did. He passed through and was gone, swallowed by the road and the morning. The yard exhaled. Horses shifted, relaxing a fraction ears, easing to a softer angle. Men lowered shoulders they hadn't realized were raised. Women let breath out between their teeth. Children tilted their heads, as children do when time changes in a way they feel in their bones. Ashfire remained where he was, body still broad, between Ethan and the world. But the tight coil in his muscles loosened. Ethan laid his cheek against the Colt's neck and closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt grateful beyond speech to be standing in a future that moments before had seemed likely to die before it began. Morgan stood where Dillard had left him, breathing hard, his coat muddy to the elbow from the struggle. When he looked at Ethan, there was something new in his eyes that hadn't been there in all the years Ethan had worked under his roof, humility, wariness, and God help him, hope. The old power had fallen in the only way such powers do suddenly after years of deserving to. And in the hush that followed, the valley waited to hear what would rise in its place. The waiting didn't last long. Morgan wiped mud from his palm onto his coat, squared his shoulders, and turned to face Ethan. The herd, the hands, the gathered ranchers and townsfolk, every gaze followed his. The man who had built Ranch Morgan from scrub and grit swallowed once, and when he spoke, the tremor in his voice didn't weaken it. It made it honest. "Cole," he said, and the name carried none of the dismissive snap it had yesterday. "I want you to take charge of every horse on this place." His chin lifted a fraction, as if daring anyone to gainsay him, and any that choose to stay. A ripple pulled through the crowd, surprised disbelief, a little outrage from the men who counted status like coin and assumed it bought everything that mattered. But no one spoke first. They watched Ethan. Ethan didn't reach for the honor like a starving man for bread. He stood very still, hand on Ashfire's wither's eyes, roaming the sea of faces, and the greater sea beyond them, the horses watching him waiting, as they had waited in the dawn. He could feel the weight of the moment settle on him, not like a yoke, but like a mantle. He had dreamed when he was a boy of being the kind of man his father had been. In the story, steady respected a hand whose word meant something. That dream had thinned as the years peeled off and took things with them, a house, a family, the feeling of belonging anywhere. What Morgan offered wasn't a return to that boyhood dream. It was something stranger, larger, more dangerous. Ethan met Morgan's eyes. "If I take it," he said quietly, "we do it my way." Morgan didn't flinch. "Say it." "No starving a horse until he works," Ethan said. "No beating one for fear. We'll train with patience. We'll listen. If an animal refuses, we find out why before we force him. We'll cull cruelty with as much zeal as we once culled the sick." Morgan's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. It was an acceptance. Done. It shouldn't have been so simple. Maybe it wasn't. But the valley had heard a choir of horses sing and seen a foreman stripped of authority by his own gun. It wasn't a day for small hesitations. "Then, yes," Ethan said. "I'll do it." The words seemed to unlock something in the herd. Ashfire breathed out as if relieved of a burden. Horses shifted and snorted softly, a rustle like grass under wind. Sheriff Dunbar put his hat back on and let out a long breath. "Well," he murmured almost to himself, "that's one way to settle it." Henderson spotted Copper in the front rank and nudged his horse forward. He didn't try to seize the gelding by the halter. He simply sat there, eyes taking in the animal as if seeing him for the first time, not as property, but as a living thing that had made a choice. "Come along, boy," he said at last, voice low. Copper lifted his head, flicked an ear toward Ethan, and then toward Henderson, and stepped away from the line. He walked back to his owner, calm and certain, and put his nose against Henderson's boot. The old rancher's throat worked. "Good," he said, and patted the gelding's neck with a hand that shook. Miller found Thunder and Banks found Duchess and cried a little, in a way he pretended was because of the wind. One by one, horses peeled out of the ranks and returned to those who had treated them well enough that a path back still existed. No man tugged a lead rope, no voice was harsh. The yard watched the most astonishing thing any of them would ever see: livestock voting with their feet. And still 50 or so didn't move. They stayed clustered near Ethan, a loose crescent with Ashfire as its point. Some were mustangs who had never been owned. Some were ranch horses who had known hard hands and closed stalls and had no wish to return to them. A few were fine-blooded animals whose owners had measured their worth by a ledger and not by a look in the eye. Those stood nearest of all. Ethan took it in without counting, as a man takes in a horizon. The number mattered less than the meaning. He had not asked for followers. He had been given them. Henderson, Miller, Banks, and the others who had repaired what needed repairing in their manners backed their horses away with quiet nods. They said nothing about the ones who stayed. In the shadow of the morning's events, they understood there are claims a deed cannot make and a bank vault cannot hold. Morgan turned to the workers who had kept their heads down for years. "Any man who stays works under Ethan," he said. "Any man who can't stomach that is free to go with a fair wage for the week." No one moved. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. Then let it be known. By late afternoon, the yard looked less like a battlefield and more like a camp after. Fences had been lifted and set right. Troughs rinsed and refilled. The splintered door on the old stable removed, as if the ranch itself refused to rehang a threshold that had witnessed betrayal. The herd was thinner now. 200 had gone back across the valley in strings no man had to lead. 50 had chosen to remain. The place felt larger and somehow quieter, as if everything unnecessary had blown away with the storm. Toward evening, the light went gold. Texas does that when it has. The mind turns its hard lines soft and sets the air to shimmering. The sky burned itself down toward the mountains, red sliding into orange, into the purple of old bruises finally fading. Ethan walked out onto the open range behind the house and stopped where grass rose like a tide around his boots. Ashfire came to stand beside him, flank brushing his sleeve. The 50 spread behind them in loose groups, heads down cropping. Heads up watching the sunset as if it were a thing they could ride. People gathered at the fence and along the ridge. Workers with hats off. Wives with shawls folded at their elbows. Children who didn't fidget because something in the air told them to be still. They did not cheer. They did not ask for a demonstration. They watched the man who had been turned away the night before stand at the center of the thing that had turned the day. "Looks like a painting," someone murmured. It did. It looked like an old story half remembered and somehow truer for having frayed around the edges. Morgan came up and stopped a few paces off, as if unwilling to break whatever cord tied man to horse to sky. "We'll have to mend more than fences," he said almost absently. Ethan didn't take his eyes off the horizon. "Yes. Reckon you'll need a proper house on the north pasture. Closer to the herds you'll train." Ethan nodded once. The idea of proper sat strangely on him. He wasn't sure yet what it meant. He suspected it would mean long days and sore muscles, and nights with his boots by the door and a colt breathing in the dark where his father's voice used to live. "You're a hard bargain," Cole Morgan said after a time, and there was the ghost of a smile in it. "I only asked for what they already deserve," Ethan said. He lifted a hand and ran his fingers through Ashfire's mane. The colt leaned into the touch like a dog, unsure whether to trust joy. Down by the road, Sheriff Dunar rested his elbows on the top rail and watched the light bleed out of the day. He tipped his hat back and exhaled in a slow stream. "I'll file the thinnest report a man ever wrote," he said to no one in particular. "It'll say, 'Horses returned of their own will. No crime committed. Recommend prayer and common sense for all involved.'" A laugh traveled the fence line soft, real eased out of them like a knot they'd been wearing in their backs. Henderson hooked a boot on the lowest rail and said, "I'll be damned if Copper didn't choose me honest today." Miller nodded. Banks kept his hands in his pockets and stared very hard at the ground's shoulders, moving once in a way that said a man was grateful and didn't want to talk about it. Night came on. The heat of the day leaked away into the grass. Stars pierced the dark one by one, then all at once, the way they do when the desert decides to show you what infinity looks like. Later, an hour or a year, people drifted back down the road in twos and threes. They spoke low to one another, telling the story already, as if it had happened a long time ago and would happen forever after. A phrase surfaced and then another, and stuck the way good names stick when the truth wants to be remembered. The day of 300 horses. By morning, it had traveled as far as the telegraph, as far as the next county's breakfast table, as far as a ranch hand's letter home. By the end of the week, a drummer in a town 2 days' ride away swore he'd seen it himself. Men from the railroad said they wished they had and believed they might yet. Legends don't wait for permission. Ethan stayed at the fence until the last of the light was gone. The horses settled one by one, a hush dropping over them that matched the hush in him. He felt neither bigger than himself nor smaller. He felt placed. The world had set him down where he belonged and told him to get to work. He turned to go and found Morgan still there, not saying anything. They stood side by side for a time longer, the kind of silence that passes between men who have both been wrong and both been remade by the proof of it. "You'll need hands," Morgan said finally. "The right kind." "I'll find them," Ethan said. "Or they'll find us." Hayes Morgan began, then cut himself off, as if the name were a taste he didn't care to keep. "There'll be men who don't like this, who don't like what it says about the way they've done things." Ethan nodded. "Then we'll show them what else is possible." Morgan held out his hand. Ethan took it. It was the first time they had ever shaken as equals. When Ethan finally walked back across the field, Ashfire ghosted beside him. The Colt's shoulder brushed his once twice a quiet punctuation to a sentence the day had been writing since dawn. At the door of the bunkhouse, his for tonight at least. Ethan paused and looked up. The sky was a dark river, full of stars. Somewhere out in the grass, a horse nickered twice, answered by another. Then stillness again. He stepped inside, set his saddle by the wall, and placed his father's brush carefully on the table. He touched it once with his fingertips and smiled. Not because life had become easy, but because it had become true. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend wounds, to salve tempers, to soothe lessons to teach to men and horses both. Tomorrow there would be choices and mistakes, and the long, ordinary work of turning a miracle into a way of living. Tonight there was this, a promise fulfilled, a people changed, a herd that had chosen its shepherd, and a story already out in the dark, running faster than any horse alive. Moneyed the story of a poor cowboy cast out for saving a colt, and the morning 300 horses lined up to wait for him. They would call it what they needed to call it. They would argue over the details and dress it up in the clothes of their own hearts. But for Ethan, the name didn't matter. Legend was thunder. Life was rain. He lay down and listened to the quiet that comes after a storm, and knew with the simple certainty of a man who has found his trail that at last he was exactly where he was meant to be.